Hello, Soberinos, and welcome to this week's Friday Fix. Today, I want to share with you a little something I've been thinking about. I've been thinking about in response to something Ruth posted a couple of weeks ago about how she'd noticed her skin had become greasier and spottier since she'd stopped drinking, and she wondered if it was anything to do with that. And so I've been giving this some thought because I wanted to be able to share with you a way of thinking about this and a way of describing this that would make sense of it and would help you to understand it. And actually, in the process of giving this some thought, I've actually come up with a way of helping me to understand it as well. Now, the metaphor which I've chosen to describe this is brand new. So I've only just come up with this. So as I'm talking it through with you out loud, it may be that I get to the point where I'm thinking, oh, actually, no, this metaphor isn't quite right, or it doesn't quite work in some way. But bear with me and we'll go with the flow and we'll see if it works or not, or we'll see to what extent it actually does work, because it does work to a degree. But I haven't thought it through to its sort of final conclusion. So any extra thoughts you have as I'm explaining this, as I'm describing this, as I'm going through this with you, if it prompts any thoughts that you can add to help extend the metaphor or develop the metaphor further, please do. Metaphors are a great way of thinking about things, a great way of describing things, because they help us to understand concepts and to process understanding things much more easily than if we were trying to think about them logically and scientifically. So I've come up with what I think is a useful metaphor for understanding what might happen to the body when we stop drinking, the body and the mind, when we stop drinking. So let's just imagine that I, as an average person, an ordinary or extraordinary person, because we are all extraordinary in some ways. Let's imagine that I'm an ordinary person going about my business. I don't have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. I'm just living my life normally. What's going on in my body and in my brain in order to take care of me, and this is where the metaphor comes in, is there are lots of different factories around my body. So I've got a factory looking after my brain and all the chemicals in my brain. I've got a factory with lots of workers, lots of factory workers who are rushing about really, really busily, making sure that they are balancing out all of the chemicals in my brain to keep me as healthy and well as they can possibly keep me. So they'll be working really hard to balance out my stress hormones, all the chemicals in my brain, the cortisol basically. They're working really hard to balance out the dopamine, the feel-good chemicals in my brain, and to make sure that enough dopamine is being produced at exactly the right time in response to exactly the right triggers and stimulants. And they're also doing exactly the same with the cortisol, the stress hormone, and they're making sure that the correct balance, or as close to the correct balance of hormones, are being produced at the right time. They're also looking after my serotonin levels. They're also looking at whatever the scientific chemicals are that look after our brains. I've got a little factory in my brain with lots of factory workers working around the clock to make sure that they are balancing out everything in my brain so it's functioning in an optimal, firing on all cylinders kind of way, that it's well oiled, that it's not leaking, and doing a really good job of looking after it. Incidentally, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, so how does that concept work? How does that metaphor work if say somebody like me had a real problem with anxiety? What's happening there with that factory? And then maybe I thought then that maybe some of those factory workers aren't as skilled as they could be. They're not yet skilled up. So you've got some elements of that factory workforce that are really skilled at doing a really good job, And some elements of that factory workforce are less skilled and need training up in order to be able to do a better job. And maybe some of the factories in our brains and in our bodies don't have enough of a workforce. Maybe they are lacking in staff. Anyway, this is the way my mind was going when I was thinking about this metaphor, and having this little factory in my brain with lots of factory workers rushing about taking care of business. And so if we extend that further, we can imagine that we have a factory that takes care of our skin, making sure the right, I don't know the word to use, but the right oils are used in the right quantities at the right time, that our skin is regenerating at the right rate. And maybe the factory workers in that skin factory are having to rush around our body to check which parts of our body need the work on our skin. So maybe they, when there's a bit of an emergency, say, I don't know, something flares up on my foot, maybe those factory workers all rush down to the foot area and they work on that, and then that takes them away from working on my chin, for instance. So I'm just kind of loosely imagining some kind of factory in the brain, some kind of factory that's working my skin, some kind of factory that will be working my heart, some kind of factory that will be working my blood vessels, and in making sure that my blood vessels are clear and pumping things in the right way. Maybe there is a factory in my stomach, in my intestines, in my liver, in my kidneys. Maybe there is a factory making sure that is responsible for my muscles, that's responsible for my joints, that's responsible for my bone structure. So I've been imagining that throughout my body, there are lots of little factories full of factory workers, all with a particular responsibility for that particular area of my mind or my body. And what was happening when I was drinking was that there was an emergency in my body. For years and years and years, there was an emergency. And that emergency was my liver, because alcohol is a poisonous toxin. And what our livers do when we drink alcohol is they go into overdrive because they're having to expel the poison from our body. And that's what our livers do. They get rid of all that poison, all of those toxins from the alcohol that we're drinking. And they have to work really, really hard to get rid of that alcohol from our bodies, which means that in a person who doesn't have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, it's okay every now and then for them to have a drink or to have a bit of a binge, because the factory in their liver, and all of the factory workers can then focus really, really hard on clearing the liver and expelling all of those toxins. And maybe that happens over a 48, 72 hour period. And then they go back to normal. They all breathe a sigh of relief, and then they all go back to normal and the liver starts functioning correctly again. But during that period of time, while the average person is drinking, it's kind of all hands on deck in the liver, in that liver factory. So maybe what happens is lots of the factory workers from other parts of the body all actually rush to the liver because they need to help the factory workers in the liver to deal with this overload of poisonous chemicals that it's having to process. So they all rush away from the brain, from the skin, from the muscles, from the joints, from the heart, wherever it is they are, and they all rush to the liver, and it's all hands on deck. They support the liver factory to expel all of the toxins and the poisons, and then they all go back to their normal jobs and the body carries on. Now, what happens if I'm drinking alcohol in an unhealthy way for years and years and years? is that for all of those years that I am drinking alcohol unhealthily, all of those different factories around my body are kind of seizing up. They're going rusty. They're on automatic because all the factory workers are constantly having to rush to the liver factory to help the factory workers in the liver factory to deal with this overload of poison that it's having to process. And so all of those factories in my brain that are looking after that balance of hormones, that balance of feel-good and stress chemicals and depressive chemicals and anxiety chemicals, that factory's been left to its own devices because all those workers are having to put their energy into the liver. The factory that takes care of my skin, it's the same. All those factory workers are having to rush to the liver to support the functioning of that liver factory because it needs all hands on deck, because it can't cope on its own with the amount of poison that it's having to process and that it's having to get rid of. So maybe, while a good way of thinking about this is to imagine that in our bodies and in our brains, all of those years we've been drinking unhealthily, a lot of the parts of our bodies that would normally run very efficiently have had to be left on autopilot because the body and the mind doesn't have enough energy to do everything all at once and to deal with the alcohol that it's having to process. So everything kind of rushes into processing the alcohol and to getting rid of the alcohol and to trying to overcome some of the damage that's being done through the alcohol and trying desperately, working overtime to heal what's going on and the potential damage that that alcohol is doing in our bodies. It's kind of all hands on deck, all factory workers rushing to that one area to limit the damage that's being done. And so all these other factories, skin, hair, teeth, muscles, joints, heart, stomach, intestines, brain, you name it, all of these other factories are being neglected because the body can't do everything. There's only a certain amount of energy that the body can put into things. Maybe sleep, maybe the sleep factory is being affected. So these factories are being understaffed. They are not working to full capacity. They have got a missing workforce. They have got an unskilled workforce because the more the workforce is being deployed to deal with the processing of the alcohol and the toxins, the less experienced and skilled they are in being able to deal with whatever area of the body they normally would be dealing with. So they're becoming unskilled. And those factories that are being left to look after themselves, okay, they might be on autopilot. They might be left running kind of automatically with a minimal workforce, but they're kind of going a bit rusty. They're getting a bit clunky. They're not being oiled. They're not being maintained. They're not being serviced. They're not being upgraded and updated as our bodies age and develop. And so there's a lot of missing work that still needs to be done in all those different parts of our bodies that we haven't looked after when we've been drinking. And this was the way I started thinking about it. And I thought, actually, that makes sense to me as a metaphor. And I wanted to share it with you to not only answer Ruth's question about why her skin might be getting greasy and spotty now she's stopped drinking, but to also share a way of thinking about what's going on in our bodies when we're drinking and when we stop drinking, to help you understand why we all get affected differently when we first stop drinking. So for some people, it might be, for me, it was anxiety. So it was to do with the factory in my brain. When all those factory workers returned from the liver to when they were satisfied that the liver had healed, that the alcohol had physically been processed out of my body, that they'd healed the damage that all those poisons and toxins had made within my liver and my body, when that had all been healed and they felt confident that they could return to their original factories, that energy started going back into my brain. There was so much damage that had been done through neglect that they had to work overtime to try and rebalance things, to try and get things back into working order. And in that process of getting things back into working order, in that anxiety managing factory in my brain, I had to go, they had to kind of trial and test things. They had to find new ways of doing things. They had to upgrade the machinery. They had to oil the machinery. And while all that work was being done, the resulting impact on me was that I was having massive anxiety attacks, massive panic attacks all over the place in my first year of living my life sober. And that was how it affected me. For someone else, it might be that they experience exhaustion and insomnia. It might be that someone experiences a lot of headaches when they first stop drinking. It might be that someone's skin becomes oily, greasy, spotty. It might be that someone becomes depressed, exhausted, lethargic. It might be the opposite of all of those, and it might be that someone actually thrives and ends up really quickly with glowing skin, shiny hair, lots of energy, better sleep. Our bodies all work in unique ways to us. But I think if you are struggling with one element of your bodily or mind's function, it can be really helpful to understand why this is happening. And why this is happening is because all of those factory workers that have been busy dealing with the alcohol and the processing of the alcohol and the healing of those parts of you that the alcohol had damaged, once that work is all done and they all return to their respective factories, they've then got a kind of catch up. They've got a clearing up exercise to do. They've got a renovation exercise to do. And while they're doing those renovations and while they're getting it back up to normal function again, it might be that you notice some side effects from that. So whether that's your sleep, whether that's your skin, whether that's your mental health, anxiety, depression, exhaustion, lethargy, emotional ups and downs, whether it's something physical in your body that you notice, whatever it is, it can be reassuring to understand what's actually going on. Is your body has been putting a lot of energy that you were completely unaware of, has been putting all of that energy and focus into your liver and into healing, and into expelling all of the toxins and the poisons that the alcohol had overloaded your body with. All that energy has been going into that. Now your body is starting to return to its normal kind of factory resets and the workforce is going to where it needs to go. You might notice some side effects, but these are temporary because, as you can imagine, the longer you stay sober, the more those factory staff get back into their previous levels of confidence with what they're doing and how to work that factory and how to make it work smoothly and efficiently. As they're relearning all of that and upgrading everything and renovating everything, they're becoming much more skilled, and eventually they'll get into a pattern, they'll get into a routine, they'll get into a habit, and all of those chemicals and hormones and oils and secretions, all of that will get into a proper balance and a proper alignment because they'll be able to put all their energy into that one thing that's their job that they need to be doing. That's it. I'd be really interested to know what you make of that metaphor. I feel like I've been talking for a long time, but I was kind of working it all out as I was going there. But that's kind of what happens. The energy that was going into processing all those poisons is now going into normal functioning of your body parts and your brain. And that's it, folks, in a nutshell. And while that's happening, you might notice some side effects. So let me know in the comments below, what have you noticed since you stopped drinking? How has it affected you? Does this metaphor work for you, or can you come up with a better one? Or can you extend or develop that metaphor in any way? If you've had any light bulb moments, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. I'll look forward to catching up with you in tomorrow's Saturday Share. And in the meantime, let's go get sober together. Bye for now.